Good evening. Irish has a very colourful military past spanning many hundreds of years. And when I first started exploring military history, I wanted to figure out how come um, we don't have very big celebrations for the Easter Rising, or how come the World War One celebrations are very subdued here in Ireland, and how come there's barely any mention of the Second World War. Well, I looked at a story about the Roscommon sniper who fought in the 1916 Rising, and how he didn't feel very celebrated after all his efforts. And I genuinely wondered, do they even talk about him in his hometown of Ballahadreen? Um, then I went on to read about the First World War. A hero if I fall, a hero if I fall, and a coward if I return, where we documented many hundreds of thousands of Irish men who served in the First World War, only to return and they didn't get any welcoming parades. In fact, they were actually, they were confined to barracks until it was safe to be released. And they were very quickly kind of brushed underneath the carpet, especially between 1916 and 1965, even 1990. So I went into the library again, and I found this book. It's called The Emergency, Neutral Ireland 1939 to 1945. It's by Brian Gervin. And I read it in the hope to see, like, how did the survivors of the Second World War, how did those Irish people fare out? And well, it's very interesting reading, I have to say. Basically, it's a book. It's based on the accounts of documents from the Irish government at the time, the British government at the time, and the American government at the time. There was no real mention about the German government at the time, but dare I ask why? I don't know. So if I was to review it, it starts off with condolences on Hitler's death, where Eamon de Valera actually conveyed, on behalf of the Irish government, officially conveyed condolences to the German legation in Dublin at the time of Hitler's death. It caused great consternation, and it made world headlines, and it was very frowned upon. How that happened, well, you really have to read the book, to the full book, to really understand where De Valera was going with that. The second chapter, anyways, is called "The Making of De Valera's Ireland, 1916 to 1938," and I suppose that really gets the start of what had happened. So, what happened in 1916? We got our independence, but there was a caveat. We either were pro-treaty, where we accepted that Northern Ireland should be governed by the UK for a little while, and then you were anti-treaty, where no, the treaty was off. So there was a civil war, and of course Michael Collins, who was pro-treaty, and Eamon de Valera was anti-treaty. However, Michael Collins got shot in Ballinablaw, and De Valera became the first Irish president of Ireland. He became head of Fianna Fáil, and even though he was anti-treaty, he had to accept, for the time being, that that we had to live with the Ireland that we were in. So from 1916 to 1938, Fianna Fáil were the major party at the time, and their objective was primarily to bring about the ultimate Ireland that was talked about by Pádraig Pearse and all the fallen heroes. It was an ideal Ireland, a self-sustaining country, independent, defining our own fate, separate from the British Empire, separate from everybody else. And from 16 to 38, they did indeed achieve those goals. However, we were destitute, bankrupt, economically far behind. we were not doing so well. And also, coming up to 1938, the IRA had actually started a bombing campaign in England to force the British government to release Northern Ireland to to this wonderful country of ours. Um, then, of course, you had Neville Chamberlain declaring war on Germany, and so we go into chapter 3, neutrality in the Phony War. Now, the Phony War was a period of time between 1938 and June 1940, where nothing was really happening. Everybody was mobilizing, but nothing was moving strategically at the time. So this gave Britain an opportunity to go to Ireland. I think the representative in Ireland was called Maffei, I think it was, and his job was to try and convince De Valera and the government to side on the side of the English. Now, De Valera had his own advisors. There was concerns that the First World War was still fresh in everybody's minds in Ireland. We were very wary about the whole idea of marching off straight into another big war. So De Valera and his advisors, they decided, the government, they decided at the time that the best thing for Ireland would be to stay neutral, and that the belligerent countries like England and Germany would have to treat them as neutral, and there was strict neutral laws that had to be followed, and in order to bring that about, the government brought in order to counteract all the propaganda and false information, they brought in censorship. And at the start, it was very tight. And later on, we'll see just how tight it got. It got exceptionally tight, and it was so much to that was the whole reason why the Second World War in Ireland was actually defined as the emergency years, because they didn't want to it was almost like they didn't want anybody to know anything about what was going on outside of Ireland. Neutrality in the Phony War, basically. What else could I say about that? Another point there about that chapter was the fact that De Valera was pushing towards using our neutrality to try and gain some sort of leverage so that we would be able to get Northern Ireland back. And on the other side, Maffei, the British government wanted Ireland to come in on the side of the English, because there was the fear that if the Germans invaded Ireland, they'd have a back entrance into England, which would not be very suitable. So anyways, we go into chapter 4, which is an offer that could be refused, and that was June 1940. And that's when things really started sparking off in continental Europe. What had happened was Germany had invaded France. France was being overrun. It was actually looking, for a time, the odds were in Germany's favour. Again, we see the leadership, or the way things were done in those times. For example, you had Hitler, who's a dictator in Germany. You had Salazar, who was a dictator in Portugal. You had Franco in Spain, and you had De Valera in Ireland, and Stalin in Russia. Like, it's all seemed to be this sort of dictatorship seemed to be it was attractive in that, like, Ireland, Europe was stagnating economically at the time, and people were looking for a clear direction. And what they were looking for in their leaders were people who were idealists, a bit extreme, a bit stubborn, a bit obstinate. And the countries around the world were like, some were democratic, like the UK or Britain, and UK and France and America, And then on the other side, you had these growing numbers of dictatorships spreading around the world, and the fear was that there was a bit of using the will of the people and pushing their agendas. Was That was what they were going on about. But an offer that could be refused was basically where the British government, at the time, the Atlantic convoys were being destroyed by U-boats in the Atlantic. You had France being overrun. Things were looking very perilous, and there was concerns that the Germans would parachute into Ireland and they'd take over Ireland just like that, and it would be game over for England very fast. So the Maffei did come into negotiations with De Valera, and he did outline, like, maybe it is possible that we could let Ireland or let Northern Ireland become part of Ireland, but the caveat was that you'd have to be in with the UK, you'd have to fight the Germans. And again, De Valera was, or they weren't going that far, because they knew that the Unionists would have none of that, basically, and they knew that it would not lead to anything positive. So things got a little fraught in Chapter 5, Neutrality in Perilous Times, May 1940 to 41. This is when the English were really up against it. France was overrun. There was a really strong chance that the Germans were going to invade Ireland. Then there was considerations that the UK government might actually invade Ireland, and we explore that in that chapter. And ultimately the English understood that if they invaded Ireland, it would be too much trouble. It would make the Irish people side with, or the Germans would literally march in. Then, like, the IRA would have helped the Germans get in, and the Irish would have helped the Germans to push the UK out. So strategically, it was not a good idea for England to invade Ireland. What really concerned the British were the treaty ports, which were down in the south of the country. They needed those ports so that it would be easier for transatlantic shipping. And if they had access to that, they could have saved thousands of lives. Indeed, they actually calculated how many lives could have been saved had Ireland allowed Britain the use of the treaty ports. Then we have, right, just coming to the end of Chapter 5, UK, or Britain, the British government had come into an agreement with the American government that there would be a lend-lease where the British could buy, or they couldn't buy, but they'd borrow from the Americans. The Americans would supply the UK, the British, and Ireland was desperately short on weapons at the time. We needed to be part of that deal, but the Americans wanted us to do it through the British. And the concerns there was that, well, obviously Britain was fighting a war, Ireland wasn't, so the priority was to get as much weapons to the English than it was to get to the Irish. And so that led to Chapter 6, The Lost American Card, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Grey and the Neutrals, and that was 1938 to 41, which was basically, we look at things from the American side. FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had appointed Grey as his ambassador to Ireland. Now, Grey was very well connected in the American government. He knew FDR, and his wife actually knew Grey more. And the thing was, he was there in Ireland. He could see that he could understand why Ireland was fighting, wanting to be neutral throughout it all. But later on, he started to realise that it was getting a little too small-minded, and that we weren't seeing the bigger picture. and he was getting concerned that like if the British did capitulate to the Germans, there was no chance we were going to have an independent Ireland. Even if the Germans gave it to us, it would be in name only. You know, it wasn't going to work out. So he could never really understand why Ireland never got to get involved with the Second World War, even near the end when it was obvious that the Allies were winning. So, anyways, chapter 6, someone in the Irish government is sent to America, the Minister for Education, I think it was. Anyways, his official duty was to go to America to see could he get more arms for Ireland, and but unofficially it was about stoking up pro-Irish feelings that maybe they could put pressure. That the American government could put pressure on the UK government to release Northern Ireland to the west to Ireland, but of course, Grey actually warned them. You know, he gave them the plan. He says, "Look, stick to this plan, and you'll do fine in America." But it didn't quite go the way it was planned, and basically, from the bottom right up to the president's office, they saw through it. They could see, like, their opinion afterwards. They had very little concern for the Irish neutrality. The Irish were seen as penny pinching, miserly, you know, looking after our own and not really thinking about the bigger picture. Very small minded, you know. So they didn't like the Americans didn't take kindly to the fact that Ireland was so neutral in all this, and yeah, because it's 1941, the British and the Americans are coming to realise that because of censorship in Ireland, you know, because I suppose I can talk about it in the next chapter in 7, Neutrality, Politics and Party in the Emergency, that because of the censorship that was going on at the time, politics in general was basically Fianna Fáil was the dominant party. All the other parties were basically allowing kowtowing to Fianna Fáil to make sure, because like if you didn't have a majority government in power during these emergency years, like, you know, everything had fallen apart, and there was always the risk that the Germans or the English or even the Americans might fucking invade Ireland. So like there was a lot of paranoia going on in the country at the time. So elections were being put off until very late. I think there was just one election, but it was very late in the war. Also, we see the consequences of censorship. For example, there was like even in the obituaries, when the British battleship, I think it was the Ark Royal, was sunk in the Atlantic, and there was an obituary for one of the Irish sailors who was aboard, and it was basically he lost his life to a boating accident. You know, how neutral was that? Like, you know, it was fucking obvious. Like he was on a battleship and he was lost in a boating accident. Like, you know, again, also, news was very heavily censored, so much to the point that nobody even, like, the newspapers were, there was no newspapers as such. Like, it was just official stuff, and that was about it. It was a notice rather than a newspaper. People were always hungry to see what was going on in the outside world. People were concerned, but, like, you know, the government wasn't supplying them the information. Getting back to the Americans and the British, as the tides of the war turned in the favour of the Allies, they started looking at what's going to happen after the war, and on account of Ireland and the low opinion that the Americans had of Ireland throughout the war, and because the UK didn't really need to depend on the Irish coming in officially on their side near the end of the war, they became aware of De Valera and the Fianna Fáil government, and they were concerned that the Irish government would try to play up all the big efforts that they had done throughout the war and play down the efforts of everybody else, kind of thing. And they didn't want Ireland to get any reparations on account of the fact that they weren't participating in the war. Also, a big one was the Marshall Plan, where all the countries affected by the Second World War, they were all given money, they were given grants, whereas Ireland got loans. You know, they did not want Ireland to profit from everything that had happened in the Second World War. They didn't, so much so that even from 1940, when the war finished, to right up till 1960, Ireland was pretty much frozen out of the United Nations. They were objecting to Ireland being part of the United Nations. You know, America vetoed it. Like, you know, there was a lot of, you know, Ireland was kind of left out in the cold for quite a long time. And is there another chapter in that? Oh, yeah, there is. But we'll get back to that one later. Chapter 8 was finally Irish volunteers that actually did go that actually did fought in the war. There was a surprising amount of volunteers from Ireland, from both north and south, and even the lowest figure, they reckoned was about 40,000. And there was other figures that went well beyond 380,000. But there's a lot of argument over those figures, because on account of the fact that during the time of the war, it was seen that, like, if Ireland was shown to have a significant amount of participation in the war, then technically they weren't neutral. So the Irish were very careful not to allow those numbers to go out, so they censored it. The UK did not want to publicly release those numbers either. They didn't keep a close eye on them, simply because that would, like, the numbers that were there, like, would have made the Canadian contribution or the South African contribution look very, very small indeed. Also, there was concerns about the numbers of Irish that were in the army and the navy before the war. And there was concerns that there was all the Irish that were working in the war industries in England at the time. It would have been a very significant number, and at the time the Americans and the British did not want to release those numbers, because they knew that De Valera's government would, use them later on after the war and show just how unneutral we were, or it would have been used for political purposes, and they did not want to allow that. So finally, you have diplomacy, chapter 9, diplomacy as ideology, neutrality, June 1941 to 45, and conclusion, the end of De Valera's Ireland. Basically, De Valera stayed in power until about 1959 or something like that. He wasn't very strong not De Valera himself, obviously, but the government were not very strong in terms of economics, and it was Lemass in the 60s who actually turned it around and made Ireland a more productive and more economic country. Again, politics in Ireland at the time, Fianna Fáil was always the dominant party. You had Fine Gael as well, which would have been a much weaker party. The Labour Party was there, but there was deep divisions in them, in that, like, some were communist and some were not. And in other words, there wasn't very much joined up thinking going on in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s as well, I suppose. So we were being, on the world stage, we were being kind of frozen out for the last 20 years after the Second World War, and internally we were becoming more and more how would you say, oh, I don't know, but it just gives you an idea that in terms of military history, like, the people that served in the Second World War, they should be celebrated more openly, just like their colleagues that fought in the 16 Rising and in the First World War as well. I found these last few months, just reading these big thick books, it really opens your eye to the kind of Ireland that we all come from, and hopefully in the future it'll be interesting to see how Ireland fares out in terms of military history. We still do it. I suppose we serve well in the United Nations, and there's also the troubles in the north. But I wonder, will I follow that next week? I don't know. We'll see. Take care.